Linda, we're ready.
Everybody can hear me all right? Yeah? You can't answer. I won't know. Before I get started, Cliff and Margaret Johnson asked me to make a little announcement about Christmas Carol at OLLI Theater. A number of us know that Paul Morella does a wonderful one-man show of A Christmas Carol. And of course, no theaters are open at this time, but they wanted you to know that OLLI has filmed a version of his stunning one-man show, and they will make it available online to anyone from December 15th through January 3rd. The cost to see this outstanding performance with one person doing all the parts is only $20, and it is a very fine show. Some of us saw it a couple of years back, and Paul Morella is a fine actor, and he really knows his Dickens. So they wanted me to pass that along to you, and now I have. And just in case you didn't realize that Dickens is so trendy, this is the New York Times. Yesterday's New York Times. Below the fold is a story about Dickens' Christmas Carol and how the theaters are trying to save the Christmas Carol and themselves too, because it's always a big moneymaker for theaters to run a Christmas Carol. There's a review today, also in the Times, of A Christmas Carol that is a one-man show as well. That one costs $50, so the OLLI theater one is a good bargain for a very good piece of theater. Okay. Two words invoke the whole story. That's just pretty amazing that just two words can make us all remember where they're from and who said them and why. And I'm going to try to help us understand a little bit more about the appeal of this incredible story. I need to clear up one thing, that there was a question about how did St. Luke's get involved in reading sections of A Christmas Carol as the second lesson in Advent, in every Sunday of Advent. This started a while back with our former rector, Stephanie Nagley, who had the idea of doing some readings instead of the epistle, but to read something from Dickens' Christmas Carol. It was her creative idea. She asked me to make the selections and write the little preface to them, which I did. It was not my idea. I was her enabler, but it was her creative idea. It also got picked up by the diocese for a while. It was on the diocesan website, and it was also in the diocesan newspaper. And I think other congregations and parishes have used the readings at some point in the past, or maybe even today. I don't know, but that's my understanding of what went on, why we have it at St. Luke's. It seems to be helpful to most of us, and an interesting change from St. Paul, who tends to write like Henry James, with one clause after another and a very complicated syntax. That's not true of the Christmas Carol, and when people read it in church, they do a good job of it. Okay, what I want you to take away from this is that A Christmas Carol very, very clearly links Christmas with the great issue of poverty. And that couldn't be more important than it is this year. The characters are very performable. It is easily translated on the stage or screen. The story has an elegant structure, which I'll talk about. It can be read on many levels. It's a work of great genius. It is a story of redemption through memory, where memory makes the connections and develops sympathy. It's done not with statistics, but with narrative, with story, and the re-education of an individual. And it's, as I said, a work of great, great genius. Oh, speaking of our readings, just to finish up on that a minute. First of all, it is done with the permission of Bishop Marianne. We do not have anything in our liturgy that is not without her permission. Stephanie did do it, and I was the enabler. So that's this whole story of why we read it in Advent at St. Luke's these days. Okay, Something else I want to talk about is the theme of Dives and Lazarus. Now, this is a story that's in the Gospel of Luke, and Dives is apparently a Middle Ages Latin version of a word for the rich man. Dives means the rich man. Lazarus is the poor man. So it's the story of Dives and Lazarus. Those of you who are musicians may know some of the splendid work that Vaughan Williams has done with the Dives and Lazarus folk tune. There's wonderful instrumental variations on Dives and Lazarus, and in the form of King's Fold, it is the basis, it's the musical basis of several of the hymns in our hymnal, including the other version of O Little Town of Bethlehem, which I much prefer to the one that we all know. But that's Vaughan Williams' setting of the Dives and Lazarus folk tune. Okay, I'm going to read the scripture to you. You can't have a church meeting without a little scripture, and here we go. This is Luke chapter 16. Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames.' But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus, in like manner, evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us.' He said, 'Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them so that they will not come to this place of torment.' Abraham replied, 'They have Moses and the prophets, they should listen to them.' He said, 'But no, Father Abraham, if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent.' He said to him, 'If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead.'" I want to say a couple of things about this. First of all, many Bible scholars feel that this is some kind of interpolation from the outside, that this is not written by Luke, and because there's so many differences between this and the rest of the gospel. We do not have this view of the afterlife in any other place with Father Abraham and so on. Another thing is, if it's a parable, in Jesus' parables, he almost never names anybody. He talks about a certain man went out, or a poor woman did this and that, but he never gives them a name. This character, Lazarus, does have the name. He is not the Lazarus who was a friend of Jesus and was raised from the dead by Jesus. So it's confusing to have the 2 Lazarus, but they're both in the Gospel of Luke. And this is part of the problem of reading this passage. Now, what most sermons that are preached on this take up the issue of someone coming back from the dead, and it's interpreted as Jesus, as the Christ coming back from the dead, for people who have the law and the prophets but need more. And so that's how it's usually managed. It has various ways of being interpreted, but the point I want to make is that in the 19th century, in Britain in particular, it was taken very, very seriously, because at that time, the economics of the time were very grim, and there were poor people showing up at people's doorsteps all the time. And the Victorians just were very worried that they weren't doing enough for them, and very perplexed by the whole thing. This theme of Dives and Lazarus shows up in a lot of writings by the Victorians and other works by Dickens, by Elizabeth Gaskell, by both Charlotte Bronte and Anne Bronte, and many other pieces of literature of the period, either by name, Dives and Lazarus, or by the theme of it. The other thing that shows up in this story and in others are ghosts at Christmas. Why do we have ghost stories at Christmas? And the point is, we all have ghosts at Christmas. At Christmas is when we remember a grandparent who is no longer with us, or the jolly uncle who always told terrible jokes, and so on. Henry James's very scary ghost story has a framed story where people are sitting around the hearth and telling ghost stories at Christmas. This was not uncommon. And as I say, we all kind of do that, and even today when we remember folks who are no longer with us. In Shakespeare says in Hamlet, no spirit walks abroad on Christmas Eve. In other words, it's safe to talk about ghosts on Christmas Eve because they're not going to harm you that evening. And so this tradition of ghosts at Christmas is picked up loud and strong in A Christmas Carol. Now, The Christmas Carol was written in 1843. And this was the period of the Hungry 40s. 1840s were a very difficult time in lots of places, and particularly in England, and even worse, of course, in Ireland with the famine. In England, the Industrial Revolution had been going on since 1765, when James Watt invented the steam engine. 1765. It had been on for a long time. It had never happened before in the history of the world. There had never been another industrial revolution before this one, and nobody understood it very well. There'd be cycles of booms and busts, and factories would open, and the next week they might be closed totally, and people out of work in ways they weren't expected. There was, at that time, no unemployment insurance. There was no workers' comp. There was no life insurance. There were no limited liability laws. And this was the first experience of industrialization in the entire world. Britain responded to it by passing the New Poor Law in 1834. In the past, the poor had been mostly taken care of by various parishes. It was the responsibility of the parish. Remember, the Church of England is a state church, and the parishes would raise local taxes from the landowners. They were called the rates, and they'd use this money to take care of the poor of the parish. If someone died, they would help out the widow. They sometimes would plant the crops. Sometimes it was with money. If someone was ill, they would help out in that way. Then when people went in great droves to big industrial cities like Birmingham and Manchester, from these small parishes, and then the factory closed, and they all came back to their parishes to get help, and the parishes were overwhelmed. There was no way one parish could handle that many people all of a sudden out of work. So this is when they passed the New Poor Law and instituted the workhouses, which Dickens took on in other works like Oliver Twist. They were very, very terrible places to be, but it was some effort to deal with the poor and the problems of the Industrial Revolution. It was based on utilitarianism philosophy, which is the greatest good for the greatest number. It was statistical. It was bottom line thinking. It was thinking of Bentham and Malthus and John Mill and others. Also, England had strict corn laws, which forbid the import of cheap grain, so that bread, the staff of life, was very expensive. There were bad harvests in 1838, a banking crisis in 1837, shortage of capital by 1840. There were long working hours in factories and mines. And in 1843, this year, when Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, Parliament asked for and got a report on children's employment in the mines and factories. And it was appalling what people read about. People responded to it. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet, wrote one of her more famous poems called The Cry of the Children. It's about this situation. Thomas Hood wrote his poem, The Song of the Shirt. Elizabeth Gaskell wrote a novel called Mary Barton. She knew quite a lot about the factory situation because she lived with her clergy husband in Manchester. Friedrich Engels of Marx and Engels wrote his book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, in 1845. He was also dealing with the problems of poverty that were in the country at the time. Dickens that year read the report to Parliament, and he also visited a London ragged school, which was a school that attempted to teach the very poorest of the poor in some of the larger cities in England. And it was mostly by good intentioned volunteers, but not very professional and hardly funded at all. It was appalling. And then Dickens's own youth gave him experience of poverty and lack of education. His family went bankrupt, were sent to debtor's prison when he was 12. He was not in the prison. He lived in a boarding house, and he worked pasting labels on bottles of blacking, that's shoe polish, in a blacking factory. He was yanked out of school, which just about destroyed him because he was so eager to learn. And so he knew a great deal about poverty and ignorance both. And he, in the fall of 1843, after he'd read this report, he decided to write a really, really compelling pamphlet and help people understand how important it was to do something about the poor. And he thought about this pamphlet for a while, and then he decided, no, he was going to do what he did best, which is to tell stories. And so he wrote A Christmas Carol with that intention, to raise the issue of poverty and make it real to other people. So this is the background and the motivation for writing A Christmas Carol. Now, what kind of religion was Dickens involved with himself? He was an Anglican all his life. He was Church of England, and unlike many Victorians, he does not seem to have had serious periods of doubt, even when Darwin started writing. Let me see here. He wrote this book, which was not intended for publication. Probably most of you don't know that this exists. It's a story of the New Testament Gospels for his own children. And it was in his family for a long time, but unpublished until I think about the 1930s, and it got out. It's a very reassuring story for his children. He did not want them to be scared by an angry God. And Dickens himself believed in a benevolent God who expected his people to take care of each other and treat each other well. Dickens prayed daily. He repeatedly is interested in the doctrine of resurrection. Those of you who suffered with A Tale of Two Cities in high school or whenever you read it will recognize that is a tale of resurrection as well. Most of his good characters are saved by practicing Christian benevolence and not through some kind of conversion, which is more of an evangelical experience, but ongoing benevolence. And his heroes do not make a big deal about their show of almsgiving. They do it quietly and helpfully. Charles Dickens knew the Bible very well, and the Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer figures in Bleak House, his novel Bleak House, very prominently. It structures it really. And there are many echoes of the Bible in A Christmas Carol. Now, most people don't recognize them, and I can point them out, some of them to you. You can find some others for yourself, I think. When I used to teach this occasionally at the University of Maryland, which is a state institution and very secular, you can teach this story to people wearing yarmulkes and headscarves and whatever other pagans or whatever they are at the University of Maryland, without offending anybody, because you don't have to get into the Christian underpinnings, which I've already opened up to you through the Dives and Lazarus connections. These are some of the things that you might think about as you listen or see A Christmas Carol. There are the three spirits in there. They could possibly be form three different versions of the Holy Spirit that we know in the Trinity. The infant child of Jesus is associated with the crippled Tiny Tim, another child needing help. And Ebenezer Scrooge is our hero. Ebenezer is a name from the Old Testament. It's not even a name of a person, it's a name of a rock or a stone of some sort. But it is from the Old Testament. Jacob and Jacob Marley, that's another Old Testament name. Dickens was not very fond of the Old Testament. He felt it was full of judgmental and harsh readings, and the Old Testament was something that very much needed the New Testament, in his view. And when you go to the Cratchit family, we have New Testament names. We have Martha, we have Tim, as in Timothy, we have Peter. These are New Testament names. Then when Scrooge is in his quarters in the early part of the book, he's sitting by a fireside which has tiles around it. And these tiles have paintings of Old Testament stories. And Marley has been dead for 7 years. 7 is a biblical Sabbath number and important. And then we have Scrooge saying things when Scrooge and the ghost of Christmas Past go over to the window, and the ghost says, well, jump with me out the window. And, and Scrooge says, I am mortal and likely to fall. Well, that's the human condition. There's more to it than just gravity. And then again, with the ghost of Christmas Past, Scrooge is walking down the road with him. He begins to recognize that this is where he grew up as a boy. And the ghost says, you recollect the way? Strange to have forgotten it for so many years. The way, I am the way and the truth and the life. I mean, these are all echoes from Scripture. And then at the very end, when Scrooge has decided to reform, and he says, I am quite a baby. He comes to this as a little child, which is what we are supposed to do. This is incarnational theology going on here. In A Christmas Carol, we see that the created world is full of good things, particularly in the passage in Christmas Present, where there are lists of all these good foods and delicious things and wonderful warmth and good drink and everything, lots of good things. Dickens, by the way, liked to write lists. He had a whole list of different kinds of foods or things that you can have. So he sets up these lists as of the good things of this created world, but these things need to be shared. And the other thing that is very clear in this story is that salvation is for all of humankind, not just the chosen few. And the way the story ends, you all know, is God bless us, everyone, not just a few. This is incarnational theology at its best. Now, the structure of A Christmas Carol is interesting. It's in 5 staves. And usually when I ask my students, what's a stave, I'll get well, it's part of a barrel, which it could be. But another meaning of the word stave is a verse, as in verses in a carol, Christmas carol. And music, it has a musical implication. There are 5 staves, and the first one and the last one are based in reality. The 3 middle ones are in some kind of fantasy world, so that we have the A section, the B section, and then again the A section. This is the way many songs are written. The structure of many songs, A, B, A, and we have it here in the story. There are many contrasts in this story between warmth and cold. And I love one of the early descriptions of Scrooge. But he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. Can't you just see the oyster on the bed of ice? I mean, it is really self-contained. Solitary is nice. But there's cold and warmth all the way through. Christmas Present is a very warm room he comes into, and the warmth it continues throughout that part of the story. The other part that I wanted in the structure is the issue of ignorance and want. Now, we read this in church in this passage, and it is in the middle, the very physical middle of the book, in the Ghost of Christmas Present. It's the very end of it. It is at the heart of the story. It's physically at the middle of the book, and it's at the heart of the moral of the story. And it's where he talks about the boy and the girl who are ragged, and one of them is ignorance, and the other one is want. And he says that of the two, ignorance is the more dangerous. That's something to think about too. Okay. The tone changes in the story from with Scrooge himself as he proceeds from terror when Marley's ghost comes in. He's scared to death of him, and at the end of it, Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, is great anxiety about the future. We go along with Scrooge as he goes through this, and we have Scrooge's views of Christmas change, and ours do too as we go through this with him. There's a great deal of focus on money in this story, and some people think, oh, well, he's just buying off his problems with money. Well, he is using money, but it needs to involve emotional generosity as well. And this is fully in line with the teaching of Jesus. Jesus had a lot of things to say about money. He said virtually nothing about sex, by the way, but he said a lot about money. So it's really timely for today. Now, in that A section, Scrooge commits some sins. Now, there are two kinds of sins. There are the sins of commission, things you do, like arson or murder or burglary. And there are the sins of omission, things that you don't do that you should have done. And our confession takes that up very nicely with forgiving us the things we ought to have done, have not done. And that's a sin of omission. Scrooge commits 4 sins of omission in the first part of the story. He won't go to the party that his nephew Fred wants him to come to. He refuses to give charity to the men who come to collect for the poor. He shoos away a little ragged boy who wants to sing a carol outside his window and get a penny from it. And he is very rough with Bob Cratchit, his employee. All 4 of those sins of omission are rectified in the second A section. He takes care of he goes to Fred's party, he finds the charity men and gives them money, he is nice to the guy, the little boy who gets the turkey for the Cratchits, and he rectifies the wages for Bob Cratchit at the very end. All of us commit sins of omission. All of us do every day. We could have called a friend who was sick, but we just didn't have time for it. Or we could have been nicer to the kids when they were having a fight at breakfast. Or we could have said something nice to one of our coworkers about a project he or she completed. Or it's this kind of thing all of us do every day, so that we begin to identify with Scrooge in his sins of omission and realize that we can rectify our sins of omission by the end of the story. This is why it's so satisfactory to read. At this point, we have identified with the experience. And as I say, we all commit sins of omission, leave things undone that shouldn't have been. Let's see, what else did I? Yeah, here we go. I want to talk a little bit about some stage productions of A Carol, but I do want to say also something about the narrator of A Christmas Carol. The narrator is very prevalent and very prominent in this story right from the very beginning. The narrator makes puns. He seems to be a sort of amiable bachelor uncle who is interested in the characters, talks about and wants to flirt with one of the prettier ones, and has other things. But he also, the narrator, is a created character, the same as anybody else, because Dickens was only 31 years old when he wrote this story. He was not a crusty old jolly bachelor. He was very much married and had 5 children at that point. And so the narrator is important. The narrator makes the judgments. We identify with what the narrator is telling us. We accept him. He is not an unreliable narrator. We trust him completely. And at the end, the narrator is kind of the moral center of the story, tells us how to think about it. And he also, by the end, it's very difficult to tell the difference between the narrator and Scrooge himself, because he's been brought around to thinking the way the narrator does. Now, the stage productions started almost immediately because this little book can be, the dialogue is all there for the text. The conversations are perfect for the stage. And within about 2 months of its publication in December of 1843, by February, there were at least 8 stage productions in London, several of which were pirated and not paid for, which Dickens was not happy about. There are many film versions and television versions, but Alistair Sims' 1951 movie of Scrooge is still considered one of the best ones around. It's black and white, and it's a heavily Freudian interpretation of the importance of childhood, and it's a very good performance. Another one is the cartoon character Mr. Magoo, Mr. Magoo's Christmas. He is Scrooge. You remember Mr. Magoo was nearsighted, and he's blind to the needs of the people around him, which works very well, and it's considered a good one. Albert Finney did a countercultural Scrooge. George C. Scott did a TV version, very good one. The Muppets are good, with Michael Caine. Mickey's is not so good. The Bill Murray Scrooge is a funny comedy. It's not really the Christmas Carol story, but it's sort of fun. Let's see, Wonderful Life is a version of A Christmas Carol where Jimmy Stewart is kind of the Bob Cratchit figure and the banker is Scrooge. Patrick Stewart has done it live, one-person show, very successfully, and he has an interesting story to tell about that. The audience reactions, if you've ever been to the theater in New York, and when people get out of a play, everybody's crowded through the lobby and rushing for a cab and pushing and elbowing their way to get to a cab first. There are never enough cabs. And after Stewart was performing in Scrooge, the general public would come out of the theater and they'd be saying, "Oh, you got here first. Take this cab. I'll wait for the next one." They got to being nice to each other because of the performance. It didn't last, of course, but that's what happened. One of the first reactions like this was by Thomas Carlyle, a Victorian sage and a well-known grouch, who read Christmas Carol and insisted that his poor wife have 2 large dinner parties. He wanted to invite everybody in for a big celebration. He didn't do the work, but he got the general idea. But I just want to leave you with the fact that A Christmas Carol links Christmas with poverty. It's right, totally connected to it, with ignorance and want right at the center. It's timely. And as we deal with the economy right now, it's even more appalling than it might have been in other years. So Dickens would be appalled and angry, I think, about the way the poor are treated these days, and it's nothing new under the sun. I'd like to do some discussion at this point and take some questions. So if you can unmute yourself and come in with some questions, I'd love to hear from you all. You are out there, right? You've all been so silent. I'm a little unnerved. Anybody hearing any of this?
Yes.
Yes, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
A lot I didn't know about A Christmas Carol.
Yeah, well, there's a whole lot more than that even, but those are some of the ways to think about it. There are many other ways.
Can I ask you a question, Linda?
Sure.
So you said that the reason why we do the readings from A Christmas Carol at St. Luke's is it was Stephanie's idea, but you were the enabler.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how did you decide which selections from the story should be read?
From my work with teaching it. I've looked at it as a piece of literature. I've also looked at it as a piece of theology. And that's how I decided. And she never questioned my selections, which was very flattering because I thought she was going to give me all sorts of direction. No, she never touched them. It was what she wanted.
So, I've always been delighted that we had it. It said so many things, and I appreciate it very much.
Well, I'm glad you were here for it. I can talk to you a little bit about other versions of it, if you would like me to do that. There's some very bad versions out there. There is an animated Christmas Carol done in 1982, which was done in Australia. It's considered the worst animation ever done of Christmas Carol, and there have been several. In 1949, Vincent Price narrated one, which was very hammy and had a terrible cast. You want to avoid that. There was a musical in 2009, which is terrible and very shallow and ridiculous. There was something called A Christmas Carol, the movie, in 2001 with Simon Callow, who's a very good actor, but it's a pretty boring production. And then there's A Christmas Carol animation done in 1997, which has awful songs and also is boring in addition. The good ones are considered the Scrooge of Alistair Sim in 1951. It's a long time ago, but it's a very good version. And there's another version done in 1984 that's also considered good. The Muppets Christmas Carol is considered good with Michael Caine. As I said, Scrooged is Bill Murray. It's funny, but it's mostly a Christmas film. Blackadder, however, has a version where Scrooge it's a reversal of everything. Scrooge is very kind and discovers that the bad guys have all the fun. and then Mr. Magoo's Christmas. Any version of A Christmas Carol should take into consideration certain things. The Cratchit home sometimes is made to look very comfortable and even sort of middle class. They should be very borderline poverty, or it doesn't work. And then Scrooge himself in the A section, the first part of the story, should be really mean. None of this twinkling little eye or, I'm really a nice guy underneath or something, because we want to look at a total change as we go through the story. And so Scrooge should be mean, the Cratchit should be poor. There should be a clear call for the morality and for charity and social justice. Ignorance and want should not be left out. It takes away the whole center of the story if they're not there.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
I never really understood the ignorance part. Ignorance of what?
No education.
Oh, literally ignorance.
Yes, literally.
Oh, okay.
Illiterate education.
Got it.
Lack of it. There was not universal schooling at this point in England. The United States was ahead of Britain on that score. There were factions. The Church of England wanted to be in charge. The Quakers didn't want them in charge. The Congregationalists had their views, and they couldn't get around to having public education for children for quite a long time. And so these ragged schools were an attempt to have somebody teaching these kids. Also, some of the denominations had Sunday schools to teach reading to these children. The evangelicals in particular, and there were evangelicals in all denominations at that point, wanted children to know how to read so they could read the Bible. The problem is, if you can read the Bible, you can also read, you know, Tom Paine or Karl Marx or a lot of other things that they wouldn't want you to read. And that's a double-edged sword sometimes.
Linda, I wasn't aware that Dickens was such a good psychologist. Actually, I was. But
just say again, Triv, I didn't catch.
yeah, Dickens was such a good psychologist.
Yes.
You know, one always thinks, well, what made him that way? What made Scrooge that way? And
that's right. Well, we see how it's almost like therapy. He's recovering the memories of his past in Christmas Past, and that is part of the healing, because he begins to remember how to have sympathy for other people and to relate to other people.
he was very
Dickens was ahead of Freud on the importance of childhood.
I was going to say, boy, he was way ahead of his time, and that's probably why
But I think any sensitive person who paid attention to children as children and not as miniature adults might have been able to come up with some of that. But no, look, hey guys, this is a work of great genius. What can I say?
Well, Linda, along those lines, and the other clergy on the call might know this differently, or I might have wrong, but I seem to remember in a New Testament class that the epistles, I believe, are written in such a way that it's the very middle of the letter where the point is, where the central theme is.
It's
and so
with St. Paul, it's really hard to know sometimes where the point is. And you really, when you're reading St. Paul, you really need to pay attention to the punctuation.
But that Dickens had that same format, if indeed I'm remembering correctly. That's very interesting.
Well, what St. Paul seems to be doing is what Henry James used to do. He would state something, and then he'd think about it and say, well, let's modify that. So they put in a clause. Well, let's modify that clause. And so the mind is very involved in working out the intricacies of the thought. And it makes for very slow reading. And this is why I say when you're reading St. Paul, you want to watch the punctuation so you know what's the subordinate clause in there and how to read it. Dickens is not doing that. Dickens is giving you a much more dramatic storytelling, and he's giving you the conversation that people had. We hear the words, and we can, as readers or spectators, we can make judgments ourselves about what's going on. It's very different. It's like the difference between Dickens and St. Paul and Dickens and Henry James. Well,
Linda,
you get the point. Yes, Leslie.
I had the privilege really of going 8 years in a row to Trinity Repertory in Providence, Rhode Island.
Oh yeah.
And it was my partner's whole family gathered, 3 generations.
Nice.
The little kids on, but the magic of it was, and what kept the tension of bringing a family back and back, if they stayed true to the story, but they tweaked it every year. And there was always something that they were waiting for. Would this happen? So it was so really magical for children to have them. They grew up into, antsy teenagers, or no, the antsy children grew into diffident teenagers. But no one ever said no to that. And it was really a very special event for our family.
Yeah, I'm very glad to hear that. I'm not surprised. I think the production would find a fresh way to look at it, or you would bring your experience of the year, which would make things very different. Reading A Christmas Carol in times of the virus is a very different experience from reading it at other times, for example. Yeah, thank you for that. Anybody else had good experiences with theater versions?
No, not really a theater version, but I was just going to say that usually every year or every other year, we travel around Christmas to Indiana. We're in a car for 10 hours.
Yeah.
But we happen to have Patrick Stewart's reading of A Christmas Carol, and we always listen to it, and it's always new in some way.
Yeah.
Because he knows how to read, and it's just, and he does different voices for different characters. And it's such a pleasure to do that every year, is to listen to A Christmas Carol being read to you. And you're a captive audience. You're in the car. You can't just wander around.
Yeah, I like it.
So it's just a pleasure. So it's available on CD if you ever want to just, you know, you're going a long way around that Christmas time of the year. It's a real pleasure to hear. And it's not very much abridged. That's a lot of it.
No, that's right. Dickens himself was really a great man of the theater, and early on in his career, he was signed up to do an audition to become an actor, and he ended up with a bad cold, and he missed the audition. And all I can say is thank goodness for that, because his stuff reads very well, and it's partly, yes, because you've got a good reader when you're hearing Patrick Stewart, but it's there in the text. Take a look at the text. You can hear it.
I'm going to buy it and read it, because I've heard it many times, but I haven't read it. So now I want to read it. That's
right. And the reading version, many of them, there's one out there I've had for a while that is Dickens' own version of it. He cut it way down. The first time he tried reading it, it lasted, I don't know, 3 hours. He'd already cut it. And he cut it back to a reading version that is about 90 minutes now, and that works pretty well. But there's so much more in the printed text. You really.
Oh, I'll get the full thing.
Yeah.
Because I'm a fast reader and I love to read.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, for example, just the opening lines, he talks about. He opens up. Marley was dead. Well, he wants to make sure you understand Marley's dead. This is not Marley walking around, but it's Marley's ghost that's walking around in this story. There's no doubt about it. The register of his burial was signed by his clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon exchange for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. And then watch what Dickens does here. Mind, I don't mean to say that I don't know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of mongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands will not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was dead as a doornail. Now, this little riff on doornails and coffin nails isn't going to show up in any theater production, but here it is in the text. It's just lovely fun.
Yeah, that's what struck me the first time I read it. First of all, I was tickled to hear you say that Mr. Magoo's version is good, because that's the one I remember from my childhood enjoying. But the first time I read it, I was struck by how funny it is, and that did come through in any production I'd ever seen.
That's exactly right. There are puns all the way through it. The narrator makes a lot of jokes, and the narrator is worth watching. Let's see, at the end of it, yes. There's another pun that you get missed. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. Now, this is a play on the word spirit.
Yes,
alcohol or ghost. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us everyone. Okay? Incarnational theology. Incarnational theology says that the incarnation was the great gift to us. God came to us in the form of Jesus. That is the gift. It is a gift of grace. We did not deserve it. It is there freely offered for us, and it is to be rejoiced in, and we are to share it. And that's what this story is illustrating, and that's what this. That's why I think that's why Stephanie wanted to read it. Anybody else?
Linda.
Yeah.
So I had a question. How was the book
greeted around the world, and how has it been received around the world since then?
That's a very good question. It was recognized almost right away as a very great work. It's to the point where serious critics are very reluctant to take it on in any way or form, because you end up being Scrooge. You know, if you don't like A Christmas Carol, what kind of a person are you? So it's hard to find a whole lot of scholarship. That's not entirely the case anymore. I don't know if you see over here. These are all books about A Christmas Carol over here.
Wow.
One of the more interesting ones is the original manuscript, which is in New York. But here is the opening of the story in print, and on the left hand, on the other side, is the manuscript.
Wow.
I like to use this for my students. You may think that A Christmas Carol just rolled off his pen.
Yeah.
There are many revisions, and there's a message there, folks. If you want to write like Charles Dickens, edit it carefully and do it more than once. And
he really could have benefited from a laptop, I think.
Well, the problem with laptops is we don't know how the composition was done anymore, because we only see the finished product or near finished product, and we don't know the different versions that may have gone through before, and that's something that's lost when that happens.
Not true, because now we have edit history. It's interesting.
Oh, that's true. I guess the legal things that they can tell that whether it's been, yeah, okay. Well, I'm not sure most writers think of it that way these days, but it certainly makes it easier to cross things out or rearrange them. I don't know how many of you saw the Little Women, the most recent Little Women one, but at the end of it, Jo March is writing Little Women, and the pages, she starts putting them on the floor in the order she wants them, and then changing them around. This is how you did it with scissors and paste in the old days to rearrange a paragraph or two.
Linda, were there well-regarded radio productions?
Yes, yes, there are, and many famous people have gotten into it. Even Eleanor Roosevelt read it at one point. Lionel Barrymore was the famous one on the radio. There probably are others now. Let's see if I have anything more about that. No, not really. Yeah, but yeah, it works. It works for the ear. It works visually. I guess it works in some cases with music, some cases not. The text is so strong. I think there are problems. It would put it at war. Are we reaching the end? Do the spirits have to leave at this point? Jessica?
No, I'm not. We don't have a limit on as far as Zoom goes.
Oh, okay, all right.
So if you guys have more questions or anything like that,
yeah, please additions and further comments. I would be very interested in your take on it.
I see that Alex has a question.
Linda, where does Dickens come down on dealing with poverty, charity versus and/or public policy addressing poverty?
Okay, there are basically three things you can do about poverty. You can do band-aiding, which is keeping soup kitchens and keeping people from freezing on the streets and getting them into shelters. That's called band-aiding. Then you can do structural changes, which have to do with the law. Some of the things I was talking about, workers' compensation and unemployment insurance. These are structural changes for poverty. The last kind of thing you can do is to empower the poor themselves. And this is done through education, through labor unions, through community organization, and this sort of thing. Now, the Victorians were mostly trying to use philanthropy to deal with poverty. And they began to realize that they had to do something legally as well. And they began passing factory acts that limited the amount of time you could spend ask your workers to work. It limited the ages that children could work, and they began to pass laws that would help improve things and get people into school instead of in the factories. And the Victorians went from the band-aiding to the structural changes, but it was really beyond their imagination, most of them, to empower the poor. That was really scary. Oh. That's the kind of stuff that led to the French Revolution. They didn't want that. Mm-hmm. If there's mob rule, it's very scary. And so it took a long time for the Labour Party to form in England, much after Dickens's time, for example.
And do we think that Dickens was of that same mind?
Dickens was clearly a liberal of his time. And he was also very interested in some other forms of reform. He ran a home for prostitutes that who wanted to be reformed and learn new skills, and they taught them how to be homemakers and to have marketable skills, and then managed to send most of them to Australia. But at least they were not in the prisons and had a chance at a new life. And he worked with patrons who had money that helped him do things like this. He was a his time.
We were.
For his time.
We're not now.
Was there another question?
We're not either.
I am, Linda, curious to ask about the question of Tiny Tim and
yes.
And almost Scrooge being on a journey to becoming Christ-like, because in the terms of the day, he was cured of something which was simply totally beyond medical science. In a way, all this redeemed Tiny Tim's life, if you will. And I was wondering about your comments on him as a character.
Well, Tiny Tim is an amazing creation on the part of Dickens. What his actual physical ailment has been the subject of a number of articles. Some doctors do detective work about it. Some think it was maybe tuberculosis, but you didn't recover from tuberculosis in those days. So others think it was some other kind of thing involving, I think, the kidneys. He didn't have enough protein in his diet, and that he could be cured if he had a better diet and better care. And the implication is that he did recover and live for quite a while. I have a couple of things here that are making me think of, but thank you for the question. There is some question as to whether Scrooge himself was ill with some form of dementia or having hallucinations and so on, which could be part of some of the dementias. But this is a medical detective work that's fun, but there's no clear answer because there's not enough information. And these are fictional characters after all. But does that deal with your question?
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? I did want to share with you a couple of things. This is a kind of feeble joke. It's the kind of joke that English teachers would think funny. Let's see how many of you like it. You know that we have the ghosts of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas yet to come. Well, I am the ghost of Christmas future perfect subjunctive. I will show you what would have happened were you not to have changed your ways. That's Christmas future perfect subjunctive. Some people like me think that's really very funny.
That is pretty funny.
I do. I like it.
You like it. I'm glad to hear it. Here's another one. This is Christopher Buckley, who is a very fine comic writer and William Buckley's son, author of Thank You for Smoking and other funny things. This is his take on Scrooge. Scrooge pre-visitation by the ghosts. Prior to all that supernatural humbuggery, Ebenezer Scrooge was a contented, prosperous businessman. He paid his taxes and left everybody alone. In addition to his other qualities, he was prescient about energy conservation, even as far back as the 1830s. Did he let Bob Cratchit, a man of unproven accounting competence, insofar as we know from the story, did he let him burn a ton after ton of coal and contribute to global warming? talk about an inconvenient truth. In addition, Scrooge's views on how to deal with the poor and the surplus population were eminently utilitarian and sensible. Did Tiny Tim go on to become a useful member of society? Did he contribute in any meaningful way? Dickens is rather silent on this point. Finally, Ebenezer Scrooge, God bless him, courageously and solitarily refused to go along with the crass commercialization of Christmas. What a shame that Dickens, an otherwise reliable moralist, should have given into such treacle and populist sentiment and turned this ethical exemplar, this quiet giant of stoicism, into a mere warm and fuzzy old cuddle bear. Scrooge as saving the climate and getting commercialism out of Christmas. Yeah, I guess so. It's fun.
It's silly.
Back to the pluperfect. Perfect subjunctive. Anybody else have comments or jokes or cartoons? You can expect to see Scrooge everywhere for the next 4 or 5 weeks, and then he goes to sleep until next Advent. I do not give this talk in January. It just doesn't work.
No. Only in December.
Only in December. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for doing it now. On Zoom.
Well,
yes, it's wonderful.
Your attention and your good questions. And, you know, I'm still here if you have others or otherwise want to get in touch with me. We can go on a little bit longer, but I don't want to keep you from your evening.
If you were to recommend another Dickens book, what would be your favorite?
Okay. The great ones, by most critics' view, Bleak House and Great Expectations. And well, David Copperfield in its way is a pretty important book as well. That's closest to his biography.
Mm.
The later ones, Little Dorrit, Our Mutual Friend, and let's see, I'm leaving out one. Tale of Two Cities is in there somewhere. The later ones are darker. They're not as funny. The first one was Pickwick Papers, which is very funny. It's hardly a novel. It's just a series of episodes and wonderful characters drawn, and was very popular. It was very popular. And the next one is Oliver Twist, which takes on the workhouse and other issues about poverty and children. But I would say in some ways, Bleak House, if you haven't read it, would be a very good form. If you haven't read Great Expectations, it's a good one too.
I tried. I didn't get through it.
Yeah, well, you know, most of these things are forced on people when they're too young for them, and or badly taught, and that is not a good thing for it. Yeah. So Dickens wrote 15 novels, so you have quite a spread of things. You can keep yourself out of trouble for a long time with that. But Bleak House is a tour de force in several ways. It has 2 narrators, and one narrator is a rather repressed young woman, and we hear her story in one chapter, and in the next chapter, there is a third person impersonal narrator who is very angry and who writes in the historical present tense. So we have these chapters alternating all the way through. It was an amazing achievement on Dickens's part in use of narration. And it must have been very difficult because he never tried it again. But that's part of the greatness. The opening of Bleak House is also magnificent. It creates London in a fog in unforgettable ways. Dickens was very popular. He came to this country twice. In fact, he was here in Washington twice. He came in 1842, just shortly before he wrote A Christmas Carol. He was already very famous, and he came in at the port of Boston in the winter, in January of 1843. and he, 1842, excuse me, 1842. And it was kind of like the Beatles coming to the United States. I mean, it was a mob scene, and they had big dinners, and they had all kinds of gatherings and honors for him. And he began speaking, and he went from Boston to Springfield, Massachusetts, to Hartford, and finally to New York. As he started in Hartford and New York, he began talking about international copyright, which was being seriously violated by the United States. That people were publishing his stuff without paying him anything. And this was not a civilized way to proceed. And so he began talking about this. The crowds were a little dismayed by this and were not real happy about it. And he wanted to see some of the newer prisons and other institutions, schools in this country, which he did see. And he visited the famous one in Philadelphia, and he went to the school for the deaf near Boston. And then when he came down to New York, he stopped in Baltimore. This was 1842, and he was in a hotel in Baltimore, and for the first time he was served by people who were slaves. And he was very, very unsettled by this, very upset by this. And then he went to Washington, and he met the president. It was John Tyler at the time, and Washington Irving was around, and they met. And he met Calhoun and Daniel Webster and who's the other one? The senators of that period. And then he went as far as Richmond, but then he was really moving into slave territory, and he had further stops planned in the Carolinas, and he really didn't want to go. And he changed his plans, and he went back north up to Pennsylvania and across to Pittsburgh, and then down the Ohio River by boat to the Mississippi to St. Louis. And he went as far west as St. Louis. When he was there, he wanted to see a prairie. So they got together as a committee and took him over across the river to some prairie areas in Illinois. And one of the people who organized this trip was the grandfather of T.S. Eliot, the poet. T.S. Eliot was born in St. Louis. We think of him as either English or at least Massachusetts, but he was born in St. Louis. His grandfather had gone out there to found Washington University, which is the great university in St. Louis. And he was there and was host to Charles Dickens. So when I was teaching at Maryland, I would tell the students that Charles Dickens in 1842 came within a mile of the University of Maryland campus because he was on the railroad from Baltimore to Washington. And that was fun to think about, but of course, the university wasn't founded until 1858, so it wasn't there when he was there. He did come back in 1867 on a reading tour of his works, and which were very popular, and of course that was after the Civil War, and he was a lot happier about being in this country at that point. But he was not happy about his trip in 1842. And after St. Louis, he went up through Ohio and into Canada, and there he was a lot happier. But he was away 5 months, I think, he and his wife, and the children were still back in England. But he was here in Washington twice. It's kind of fun to think about that.
What a long trip, though, to take.
It was when he came over. It was a hard trip. It was winter, and they had bad storms. He was not sick, but everybody else was.
Oh dear.
Yeah, including his wife. And they were pretty homesick before they got home, and the kids were young, and he needed to get back. The latter part of his life is, of course, not so sterling. He did leave his wife and 10 children, and have a mistress, and nobody knew about it for many, many years, but we all make mistakes.
We can still ask Linda questions and talk. I'm not saying that we have to be done here, but I do want to remind you about what I put it in the chat information about what's going on at the OLLI Theater. That's a good to hear A Christmas Carol, see it, experience it, but it's also a good way to support the arts in the time that, you know,
It really is at a time when they really need it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We're hoping to do a read through of the 90-minute version via Zoom. We'll just divide up the parts, and I mean, like different people would have different parts depending on the state. Did I get it right?
Yeah, I think so.
But we're hoping to do that on December 12th at 6:30 p.m. We were supposed to sing Christmas carols in a socially distant way outside, but it seems like that's not a good idea anymore. So instead, on December 12th, we will do a read through, not a rehearse or anything like that, just a read through it, particularly doing it that day because that's the day that we would have had a Christmas party. And I feel like my body is going to know that I should be with you all that night. So that's the best way for me to conjure a way for me to be with you that night. So December 12th, I think we're going to do a read through, and I'll send you more information about that.
Thank you. That's a really good thing to do. Yeah. Thank you, Jessica. Watch out, it'll become a tradition.
It's a great idea.
Yeah,
It sounds like fun.
Yeah.
I think when this is all over and we can actually meet in person, we're going to become nostalgic about Zoom meetings.
Yeah, there's no traffic and the parking is real easy.
That's true. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, Linda.
Yes, thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
Go forth and do likewise, or at least read the book.
Yeah.
Thank you, Linda.
Sure,
Thank you.
It's my great pleasure. Believe me, I love doing this. Thank you.